Let's cultivate our motivation. So we're here yet another day. Our life made possible by the kindness of other living beings. And so for a minute, just really feel how you're part of this network of living beings who benefit each other through the various actions we do, enabling all of us to stay alive. So this thought that thinks, I'm special, I'm different, I'm more important than all these other living beings. That thought is really inaccurate, because we don't exist as independent, self-enclosed entities. We're dependent in many, many ways. And so with a mind that wants to benefit all the other parts of the whole that we are a part of, and yet with a mind that is not attached to any of those, let's generate the altruistic intention and the aspiration for full awakening. So it's hard, isn't it? We're part of that whole, but we're the special part of it. Yeah. Somehow, that feeling inside of you, yeah, I depend on everybody else, but I'm separate from them and I'm really more important. Hello? Do you have that feeling? Yeah, very much. I've had that feeling since beginningless time. So we're always on the lookout for me and what can benefit me and what harms me and what helps me and what I like and what I don't like and what people think of me and what I think of them. And oh, it's exhausting, isn't it? Yeah. Sickening. Sickening. And exhausting. And always trying, how do I fit in? How do I navigate this? How do I look like I have compassion but really get what I want? Yeah. So, this internal enemy is really quite persistent and very conniving, very clever and deceptive. So we have to be quite careful around it. So the first way to start chipping away at this me, I, my, and mine is to restrain our most outrageous negative actions, which are actions of body and speech. They're the grossest ones. Yeah. So of course everything originates in the mind. The body and speech don't act unless the mind has an intention. Yeah. So because the body and speech are grosser activities, they're actually easier to manage than the mental activities. So that's why we start out taking the 5 lay precepts, because those are covering the very gross non-virtues of body and speech. The monastic precepts cover actions of body and speech too, but they're much more detailed, more refined. Yeah. So we always start out with the 5 precepts. So in the ordination ceremony, after you've gone through many of the discussions that we've done already, then there's the section on taking the 5 precepts. So this is for people who have not taken the 5 precepts before. Usually, in fact, every time we've given ordination here, we've never had to do this, because we ask that people take and keep the 5 precepts for some time beforehand. Yeah, but there's a few things that are interesting to say in this section. But before we do that, we need to have the Sravasti Abbey Choir sing that verse for us.
Which one is it again?
Okay, let's see. Which one was it? No, we did integrity. How wonderful, great, courageous one.
Okay, this is totally unrehearsed.
And then the next one, take refuge in the great world honored ones.
These are not rehearsed here.
Okay. That's what you said yesterday, too.
No one's seen these scores.
Okay.
Okay. How wonderful
The great courageous one, you are able to. The world is immanent. Leave the worldly life, proceed to nirvana. This is rare and hard to comprehend and speak about. It's good. Yeah. Okay, then the next one. Do you want me to read it first? Take refuge. You may have changed the words a little bit from it. Take refuge in the great world-honored ones who are able to cross over the suffering of existence in the 3 realms. May all sentient beings completely enter the bliss of nirvana. Take refuge in the great world-honored ones who are able to cross over the suffering of existence in the 3 realms. May all sentient beings can harmony enter the bliss of nirvana. That was nice. Good. So we need some practice, but we're getting there. Okay, because one of our things at the Abbey is we want to be able to do all these things in English so that you really understand what is happening in the ceremony, and you understand what's saying, what's going on. Okay, so with the 5 precepts, okay. So there's just some instructions first, that you give the 5 precepts, and then you give the 10 Shramanera precepts. And if they've already had the 5 precepts before, then you skip this section and go right to the part of giving the Shramanera precepts. Okay. So then the Upadhyaya, this is different than the usual refuge ceremony. It's a little bit different. Not much. Okay, but the Upadhyaya, the preceptor, says, son or daughter of a good family, the Buddha Dharma is as vast as the ocean. The more one enters it, the deeper it becomes. That's something important to remember, that what you're studying now, you will hear the same teachings over and over again. So don't say, oh, I've heard that before, I don't need to hear it again. Yeah, because as you purify, as you create merit, then what you hear in your heart from hearing those same words will change. Okay, so it's really true. The more you purify, the more you create merit. You see all sorts of different layers and things that you didn't see before. And I remember this really came to me the first year when I went to Kopan, and I heard I attended the November course. And then that year I stayed and practiced, and in the summer I did Vajrasattva retreat. And then I came back for the course the next year. And, they were basically teaching the same stuff. But I was going, oh my goodness, this sounds entirely different. Yeah. And it was because not in the change of the words, but the change in my mind. Okay? So learning Dharma isn't just about learning words and lists and numbers and things like that. It's about integration in ourselves. Yeah. And so that's why, like when His Holiness the Dalai Lama teaches even the basic topics of the Lam Rim, precious human life and so forth, everybody comes. None of the other great lamas say, I've been hearing that for 50 years already. I'll skip these days and come when he's teaching emptiness. No, everybody comes. Even though those same people teach those texts, you still come, His Holiness. Why? Because every time you hear something, it goes in deeper. It resonates with you in a different way. Yeah? So give yourself the time and space for the Dharma to sink in. Yeah. Don't kind of think, oh, well, I have to learn it all and get it all and practice it all perfectly right away. Yeah. No, it's a gradual process. It's very different than learning stuff in school. Yeah. No, some places that, they have, some monasteries, they have tests and so on. Yeah. Personally speaking, I think a little bit of the old hippie remains in me. And, I don't want to give people tests. Although some people say it's very helpful to get them to study. Because I want people to be self-motivated. Yeah. And contemplate the material on their own because they see the value in it. Okay. So the more one enters into the Buddha Dharma, the deeper it becomes. Since you seek to go forth, you should first take the 3 refuges and 5 precepts so that you can closely serve the Sangha. Okay, now that's interesting. Yeah, you're taking 3 refuges and 5 precepts so you can serve the Sangha. It's also done so you can tame your own restless body, speech, and mind. But it's a way of entering in to being close to the Sangha. How do you learn from the Sangha? You offer service. Yeah? And when you work with people who are practicing, you watch how they work, and then you learn how Dharma is integrated in daily life. Okay? So, Yeah, sometimes we think, oh, offering service, such a drag. Why can't these people do the stuff by themselves? But, if it's, we Americans are not very subtle. Yeah. In Asia, people are much more subtle. And, if you're junior, you go and you serve and you learn by observing your teachers or your mentors. How do they deal with different situations? How do they respond? Not that everything they do is perfect, but you can really learn a lot about how Dharma can be practiced on a day-to-day basis by observing other people. And the only way you're going to get to observe them is if you offer service. Yeah. Otherwise, the monastics are in their part of the monastery and the lay people are in theirs. Although we mix things up here a little bit. But I remember when Venerable Pema came, she was very surprised that she had so much contact with the monastics, because in Asia it's quite different, isn't it? Yeah. And so that's the way you really get to learn, is when you're offering service, then you can bridge that gap. Okay, so it's saying take the 3 refuges and 5 precepts, and then you can receive the 10 Shramanera precepts. Okay, it says what matters is your concentration and sincerity, so do not be conceited or negligent. That's important, and this applies to us for all levels of our practice. Our concentration, our focus on what we're doing, and our sincerity. Okay, and then not being conceited and not being negligent. Yeah, so conceited, thinking we're really special. We are God's gift to the Buddha, so to speak. Yeah, they should have, this community should be so happy to have me as a member. I have so much to offer. I have so much to give. Okay? Yeah, like I think I may have mentioned to you earlier on, if you have that attitude in the Tibetan monasteries, they completely tear you to bits. Yeah. Beginning with your teacher and then your classmates too. Okay, or negligent, negligent. I have better things to do. I'm living here at this monastery. I'm enjoying the offerings. That's great. I'm glad people give me lunch. But, I don't really have to do very much. I can get by, with minimum activity. I'll just do what's barely necessary. Yeah. Or I'll get in, under the wire. Yeah, under what? Yeah, I'll live here under the radar, so nobody will notice my faults, nobody will comment on them, and that way I'll get along with everybody. Yeah. But then what that amounts to is then we're not really involved, are we? Yeah, we're always negotiating in our mind, well, what's the minimum I have to do so they don't call me out? Yeah, and how can I do that minimum without getting called out for making a mistake or whatever it is? Yeah. So do you see the conniving, self-centered mind, how it operates? Okay, so that's the instructions, and then you take refuge, you take the precepts, you do the refuge formula, which is actually the taking of the precepts as well, and then you go through the precepts one by one. The preceptor states them and says, can you keep this? And then you say, yes, I can. Okay, so I think everybody knows the 5 precepts: to abandon killing, stealing, unwise and unkind sexual behavior, taking intoxicants, or lying and then taking intoxicants. So the first four have two levels. You can either break them from the root, or you can have a more minor infraction. So breaking it from the root, this is in terms of the 5 lay precepts, would be killing a human being. Stealing one from the root would be stealing, taking something of value in the place where you live, such that the government would get involved. Unwise and unkind sexual conduct would be, if you're in a relationship, going outside of it, or if you're not in a relationship, going with somebody who is. And then lying, to break it from the root, would be lying about spiritual attainments. Okay. But then those four also have more minor transgressions, minor infractions of them. So for killing, it would be killing any other living being. Okay. For stealing, it would be stealing other things. Unwise and unkind sexual conduct, it would be, I've kind of redone this precept the way I give it, because I think that this precept is very dependent on culture. Yeah. And so the way I do it is having unprotected sex, if there's danger of sexually transmitted disease, or, having consensual sex when it's consensual, but you suspect the other person is getting attached to you, but you're just basically using them for the pleasure of it. Okay, because that's very harmful to people's feelings. And then lying is, all the other kinds of lies we tell. And then the one with intoxicants, it is not a naturally negative action, so that doesn't have a root and a minor infraction portion of it. So that one, the way I give it, is not 1 drop of alcohol, not 1 puff, nothing, Some teachers give it differently, but I find it much easier. The way the Buddha actually gave it was nothing at all. Of course, if you have a prescription for something and you're following the doctor's orders, by all means continue with your meds. Okay? But this is talking about recreational drugs and intoxicants and so on, those kinds of things. Okay. So then you get to the section of then the candidate leaves the room, and we have a Sangha Karman. A Sangha Karman is an official transaction of the Sangha. So it's the Sangha coming together and making an official binding agreement. So usually before you have the ceremony of a Sangha Karman, there's a lot of discussion beforehand. And everybody talks about it, they bring up their doubts, they bring up everything. And then once people reach a conclusion after all the discussion, then you have the Sangha Karman. That's kind of like the official thing where, we do it. And, somebody makes an announcement, and there's a proclamation. There's different kinds of Sangha Karman, and there's a conclusion. So sometimes there's just a motion, sometimes 1 proclamation, sometimes 2 proclamations, sometimes 3. But in any case, you express your consent by keeping silent. Yeah? So things are done on consensus basis. So that's an interesting way to do things, on consensus basis, because one person can throw a wrench in the whole thing. Yeah, everybody else can agree, but one person can hold out and throw the wrench in. So that means that each individual has to think very, very well. Yeah. And if it's a situation where everybody in the community agrees on one thing and you don't agree, then you have to ask yourself, what is my disagreement based on? Are there factors here that I think people are not seeing? Have we discussed those factors? Have I brought them up? Do I think the Sangha is really committing a big mistake by making this decision? Or is my lack of agreement with the Sangha because I feel slighted, I feel insulted, I don't feel valued, or I have a different personal preference? In other words, is my disagreement with the Sangha based on wisdom and caring for the Sangha, or based on my sensitive ego and my own personal preferences? So each person has to look carefully at that. If they're the one person holding out, so it's not a system where you can go, oh, goody, I get to have the deciding vote, and they can't do anything unless I go along with it. Because everybody has that responsibility. For when you're a member of the community, you have that responsibility to really see what is the basis of my disagreement with the Sangha. Okay? So this isn't a situation where there's been a lot of discussion and everybody but you, is going in one direction and you want to do something else. Okay? So it's a big responsibility, actually. Okay, so the Sangha, the candidate leaves, the Bhikshuni or Bhikshu Sangha has a Sangha Karman where they agree to give the Shramanera precepts or Shramaneri precepts to this person. Okay, and then that person comes back in and we do the confession chant, because it's very good to purify before you ordain. So if you're interested in ordaining, it's really good to do a lot of purification. For many reasons. Because the more purification you do before you ordain, the more you're eliminating obstacles to your understanding the Dharma, so that when you ordain, you understand the Dharma better. Okay? But also, the more purification you do before ordination, the fewer obstacles you're going to have afterwards. Because sometimes we think, oh, I take ordination, then everything's going to be rosy. Everything's going to be great. And the thing is, when you ordain, you're doing something very virtuous. So, that also means that self-centered mind is getting challenged. Ignorant mind is getting challenged. And they're not going to roll over and say, I give up easily. They're going to fight back. Also, because you're doing something so virtuous, sometimes some negative karma ripens. And we see this very often with people. Right after they ordain, there's some negative karma. Sometimes it manifests as sickness. Sometimes it manifests as your ex-husband. Sometimes... Sometimes it manifests, all of a sudden you can't stand your teacher, or you can't stand the community. There's all different ways that, karmic obstacles arise. Or you just go through a period where you're just mad at everybody. There's one person, I shared a room with her the night before she ordained. I won't tell you who she is because she's quite well known. But she was so angry. I couldn't believe she was getting ordained because she was just angry. What was coming out of her mouth the whole night before and the day after. So, this kind of thing happens. Yeah. So these kinds of things happen. So you have to be very clear about your motivation. Yeah. And have a very strong determination and not let kind of these incidents of negative karma just throw you off track. Yeah. Because even after you get over the initial hindrance, samsara is one big hindrance. So things keep on coming up. And that's why it's so important to have this long-term view. Yeah, and really know where you're going in the long term with your spiritual practice. And then these bumps come in the road and you recognize them for bumps instead of, just saying, it's impossible. Can't do this anymore. You just say, okay, here's another bump in the road, either because my self-centered thought's going crazy or some negative karma is ripening, but this is all part of the practice. Because why did the Buddha teach the thought training practice? Especially the section of the thought training that's called transforming adversity into the path. Why did the Buddha teach that? Yeah, it wasn't because he had nothing better to teach. It was because we all have adversity. Yeah, we're in samsara, we have adversity, so we have to know how to deal with that adversity by knowing how to think differently. Because if we rely on our old ways of thinking, then when the adversity comes, we fall apart. So that's why we have to really practice the thought training, very frequently throughout our lives in all sorts of different situations, and get very familiar with it, and even use it to look back on things that we've gone through in the past and process them in light of looking at them in a different way. Okay? So I can feel it's time for my Sam story. Yeah, because this is what I had to do when I think I may have mentioned it to you before, that I had a problem with anger, but I didn't know I had a problem with anger, and so my teacher sent me off. I was supposed to be the Gegu, the disciplinarian for the Italian monks, and another nun was supposed to come and be the spiritual program coordinator. And then she couldn't come, so I got both jobs. And I was working with, she can attest, macho Italian men, yeah? Yeah. So it was a real experience for me. First of all, they did not want a woman who telling them what to do, in the Sangha. And, if they weren't at morning puja, I had to go wake them up, and they didn't like that, and they didn't like this, they didn't like that. And, basically they were macho. They didn't want to listen to a woman. And I remember saying to Lama, I happened to be on the phone with him one time, very early on in my stay here, and I said, Lama, these guys don't tend to like women very much. I don't think they want me to be Gegu. And his response is, well, where are they going to go where there aren't women? Yeah, they better get used to having a woman there. Of course, he told me that. He didn't tell, I don't know if he told them that. But, and I'm a pretty independent person, and I think for myself, and they took great pleasure making fun of me. I remember sitting in meetings and, teasing me and da 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 da. And I mean, all sorts of stuff going on. Okay, I won't bore you with all the details. But I was getting really angry. I mean, I'll tell you one thing that one of them did. We were working on making a sadhana. We had to produce the sadhana in English and in Italian. And I was working on it with another monk. The director, who was Sam, came and took it out of my office without telling me when I wasn't there. So I'm looking around for this thing, and he just had taken it, and he was going to do with it what he wanted. Anyway, so I was getting outrageously angry. And each evening I would go back to my room, and chapter 6 of Shantideva, I would study that, because chapter 6 is really the basis for transforming adversity into the path, because it teaches you how to deal with your own anger. Yeah. So there were various methods that Shantideva outlined. I think one of the ones that really helped me, that resonated with me a lot, was that I created the cause for this to happen through my negative actions in the past. So I created the karmic cause. These people are just the cooperative conditions. Yeah. Whatever I did in the past, I clearly was unfair to others. I clearly blamed them for things they didn't do. I humiliated them. I was basically a jerk, whatever lifetime or lifetimes, but it was through my own self-centered actions, motivated by, anger, pride, or jealousy, or whatever. That was the principal cause for me now experiencing this. And I had to really sit there and say, they aren't the cause of my unhappiness. It's a ripening of my own negative karma. And I have to find a way. It was always very clear to me during that the problem, I wanted to blame the situation and I wanted to leave the situation, but I always knew that that the real problem was in my mind. Yeah, and the real change had to take place in my own mind. Yeah, so that's, I wrote to Lama at one point and I said, Lama, I'm very unhappy here. All these people are making me create negative karma to go to the lower realms. You see, I couldn't even accept responsibility for my own negativity. They made me do it. But I was still trying to practice transforming my anger, doing something with my anger, because I knew very clearly I had to. Yeah, it was life and death. I mean, you can't live with anger in your heart for so long. It's just too painful. So, so I wrote and I said, Lama, can I leave? Yeah, and he said, we'll discuss it, dear. I'll be there in 6 months. He might as well have said 6 eons, But I made it through the 6 months. And then after that, I wound up going back to visit my parents, which was another thing. Boy, I had to practice through that, because they thought I was completely off my rocker. And so I mean, throughout these 40 years, there's always been situations. I think I mentioned to you before, when I was at the nunnery, the monastery, and we had to pay for heat in our own room, and I didn't have the money to do that, and I had to really look at my own miserliness and made a firm decision to change it. So these kind of thought training practices where you see that, why am I experiencing this hindrance? This is because of the karma that I've created, the problems with my self-centered thought creating these actions. And if I don't like the results of the actions I've created, then I better stop creating those actions. I better change my behavior. It's what they call learning from your boo-boos. Yeah, so I better learn from my mistakes, because otherwise I'm just going to keep having the same problems again and again. Yeah? So there was a lot of that. The thing of taking karmic responsibility really resonated with me. And also, learning to differentiate in a situation what's my responsibility and what's the other person's responsibility, and so stopping the blame game. Yeah, so when we were talking about trust yesterday, it was making me think of situations where trust was broken. But like I mentioned yesterday, part of it was because I had unrealistic expectations of people that I hadn't bothered to check out with them. Do you agree to do X, Y, Z, this, sign your name at the bottom? And, the first condition is you're going to do everything I want you to do when I want you to do it. Did the other person sign on for that? Or did I just expect that of them? And if I expected that of them, that expectation is my problem. Yeah. And when I was so upset with my parents because they didn't accept me for who I was, then I had to face the fact that I didn't accept them for who they were. So what in the world was I complaining about? Yeah. Why should they accept me for what I was if I'm doing the same thing and not accepting them? I have to get my own house in order first. So that part of the Dharma, of the thought training practices, I felt really, really helped me, And, there's many more situations, oh my goodness. But, you have to learn to deal with those things when they come up while you're ordained. Yeah, because if you don't, then you're going to blame your problems on the ordination, and you want to disrobe, and you think that if you disrobe, then you won't have that problem anymore. Okay, so that's often like, the dog who's here in the courtyard scratching his fleas, who gets up and walks to this corner of the courtyard thinking that the fleas will stay there and that he's leaving the fleas, but the fleas come with. Okay? So, yeah, sometimes it does help to change the external situation for a while, to give us some openness in our mind. If our mind gets too narrow, it's good to, be in another situation and like, oh, wow, there's a world out here. Boy, was my mind really narrow, and then that helps you to kind of process what you've been going through. But, it always comes back to being responsible for the state of our own mind. Yeah. So how did I get off on that? Oh, yes, because we were purifying here. Yeah. So, we have to keep purifying all the time. It's not that, you do 100,000 Vajrasattva and, okay, I'm all pure now, and then you look at your mind, no, I'm not all pure, there's a lot of garbage here, And so you have to keep purifying. We create negative karma every day, so we should purify every day. Okay, and create merit. And listen to teachings. Okay, so then we have the verse from the King of Prayers, the confession verse. Every harmful action I have done, every single one since beginningless time. So here we're revealing, we're repenting our negativities. So it's not just, kind of, oh, that mean thing I said to somebody today. It's like everything from beginningless time, whether we can remember it or not. And who knows what we've done that we can't remember. Okay? So every harmful action I've done with my body, speech, and mind. So everything, what I've thought, what I've said, what I've done. Yeah. Overwhelmed. Why did I do those things? Overwhelmed by attachment, anger, and confusion. So attachment, wanting, clinging, anger, wanting to harm, get away from something, confusion, not knowing, not being able to differentiate what is virtue from what is non-virtue. Okay, so every harmful action I've done with my body, speech, and mind, overwhelmed by attachment, anger, and confusion. Yeah. All of these I openly lay bare before you. So it's not like, there's something I am so ashamed of. Yeah, Buddha, I really don't want to tell you about it. I am so ashamed of this, whatever I did. So I'm confessing everything else, but this one I can't really bring myself to admit that I did this horrible thing. So I'm stuffing that one under the table. But I'm confessing everything else. So no, the verse doesn't say, all of these, but a few of them I'm really ashamed of. I openly lay bare before you. It says all of these, period. So that, sometimes we really need to work on ourselves to be able to admit to ourselves what we did, because we don't feel good about it. Sometimes with these kind of things, we need to really look closely. The things that I don't feel good about doing, am I responsible for the whole thing? Or were there other factors and other people involved such that I am blaming myself for things that really aren't my responsibility? Okay, so in the case, let's say, of childhood abuse, very often the children feel ashamed, like I made this happen, something was wrong with me. Yeah. I remember one friend when she and her husband were divorcing, and her son said to her, I know why Daddy's leaving. It's because I'm naughty. And she said that just crushed her heart, because it had nothing to do with the kids. It was between the husband and wife. But this is what little kids do. They blame themselves for things that are not their responsibility. So we may have done that when we were little kids, taken on something, blamed ourselves. And then, we've had stories here where people have told that, And then one man was telling one story where he was sure he was responsible for something. And then he asked his mother when he was an adult, and she said, no, you weren't the one who did that. Somebody else did. And he said it was like this huge boulder was taken off of his head. Yeah, because for all those years he had thought he had done something. Yeah, but it wasn't him. So it was little kids, We often do that. We blame ourselves for things that aren't our responsibility. Yeah. And so to look at situations and to really learn to differentiate what is mine and what is somebody else's. So if part of it is somebody else's, it doesn't mean that we go, oh good, thank God, now I can blame them. That's not the answer. It's not like now I can shift the blame to somebody else. But it's like, okay, I've got to be able to look with wisdom and differentiate in these kind of situations. What was my motive? What did I do? What was going on with the other people? Yeah. What was I projecting? What were they projecting? So that we can have a much more realistic view of these kind of situations. Yeah. And then when we see the part that is our responsibility, then yes, we can open up and confess it. There it is, I did that. Okay, but we can also, the person who did that, whatever we did that we don't feel so good about, that we now recognize was something harmful and we have regret for, instead of sitting there and like going, oh, I'm so awful, how can I ever forgive myself? To look at that person who we used to be and know we are not that person now. Yeah, I am not that 20-year-old who did that stupid agio that was amazing, or I am not that 7-year-old who did this and that, I am not that person. But there's a continuity between that person and me, and I can understand that person well. Yeah, you can understand who you were as a little kid, can't you? Yeah, you can understand who you were when you were in your 20s and did outrageous things. You're not that person now. But you can look at that person who you were and have some compassion for that person. Because you understand their flawed way of thinking. You understand their loneliness or their whatever it was, whatever suffering they had that made them do that action. You understand that very well. So you can look back and have some compassion for that person. And also confess, the harmful thing they did motivated by their suffering. And I think that is very, very psychologically healthy. It really alleviates all kinds of stuff. Yeah, because the more we stuff under the table, the more it just festers like rotten what?
Garbage.
Thank you, garbage. Yeah, but it does, doesn't it? Yeah, whereas you just bring it up. Okay, boy, I was really confused when I did that. Yeah, I was confused because I was unhappy, and I can have compassion for the person I was, and also open up and confess that wrongdoing. And I don't blame myself at all because I'm not that person anymore. The person I am now is not going to do that. Okay, are you getting what I'm saying? Yeah, is this making some sense? So anyway, this is how I deal with it. Yeah, you may have some other ways. I'm just sharing what I do. Okay, so we do the confession. I think there's a relationship between compassion and confession, besides their spelling. Okay, now we get into the going forth and the giving of the Shramaneri ethical restraint. So, ethical restraint, this is a new translation, because having talked to people over the years, we often say vows, and I remember Bhikkhu Bodhi at one of our monastic conferences being quite strong about this. We do not take vows. Yeah, we have precepts. So then another person said, well, a vow is like the whole set of precepts. So you take the vow of a Shramaneri or the vow of a Bhikshuni or a Bhikshu. But still the use of the word vow, I think, can be quite loaded. For people who were brought up in certain religious traditions using the words affiliated with those traditions that had a certain meaning, then you use that same word in Buddhism. It's so easy to bring the connotation of it there into Buddhism, So, for example, in the Lamrim Chenmo, they translate one word. I translate it as negativity. They translate it as sin. I hear the word sin and it's like, that does not help. And also because the Christian idea of sin, especially original sin, is very different than the Buddhist concept. Yeah, so taking the word sin and putting it into Buddhism is hard. It's misleading. And I think it can be the same with vow. Yeah, because in a Catholic context, you take very few vows, but it's like, this is it. You promise you will never, ever, ever do that. And if you do, you know what's going to happen to you and where you're going. Okay, so if you've been raised with that kind of connotation, then you hear, we take vows, then it's like, you go into that whole fear-based thing of, I can't break this, otherwise I'm going to hell, and, karma's just another system of reward and punishment, and all that kind of stuff, when it's not. So I was talking with one friend of mine who knew Sanskrit, and the Sanskrit term is samvara. So he said it's more like an ethical restraint. Yeah? It's an ethical restraint that you are voluntarily training yourself in. Yeah. And so Bhikkhu Bodhi said we could call them precepts, but even trainings. They're trainings. The whole idea in Buddhism with precepts is that we are training our body, speech, and mind. Okay, so yes, we're saying I won't do that. But the understanding is I'm training myself in not doing that. So that's not that we give ourselves permission to do it. It's that sometimes our mind is overwhelmed by afflictions, and we do what we wish we didn't do in terms of the precepts. Yeah. And so then we need to open it up and confess and make amends. Okay. So it's much more the idea of an ethical restraint. And to remember that we are voluntarily taking these. The Buddha is not forcing them on us. And unlike Catholicism, if we want, well, actually the Catholics now too, you can give your vows back, but you have to go through a lot to do it. In Buddhism, if you get in a situation where you feel you really can't do it, you just say to somebody who understands the meaning, I relinquish my precepts. Yeah, I pray never to do that, but, there is that in Buddhism. Okay, so ethical restraint, he also said ethical code, that we're abiding in a certain ethical code. Okay, so it's if you have a lot of connotations about vow and what that means, try and see afresh what these things mean in a Buddhist context. Okay, so first we have to get into the topic of natural negativities and things that are proscribed by the Buddha. Proscribed, not prescribed. Okay, so natural negativities are actions that, virtually any ordinary being to do them would have a non-virtuous mental state. Killing, stealing, unwise and unkind sexual behavior, lying. There's going to be a negative mental state. So that's called a naturally negative action, because any ordinary being who does it is going to be creating negativity. Then there's a whole lot of our precepts that are not naturally negative. They're things that people could do with all sorts of different motivations. So just doing that action itself doesn't create negative karma. Okay? But all of those different precepts, whether they're natural or not, are proscribed by the Buddha. So you have two elements. For some of the precepts, they're proscribed by the Buddha, plus they're naturally negative. Other ones, they're not naturally negative, but they are proscribed. Okay? So in terms of the naturally negative ones, then the bhikshus have 4 roots precepts, the bhikshunis have 8. And if you do those, and there's all sorts of conditions that have to be satisfied to complete it, then how different traditions say it differently. Some say you are no longer a monastic, and you're expelled, or you've expelled yourself, basically. Others say you are still a monastic, but you have a root transgression. And so in that case, you actually need to return the rest of your ordination so that you don't continue to create negative karma. So there's different views. Different schools have different views. But it basically, the practical result is you're out. Okay? Then there's still other things that are naturally negative, like killing an animal, but they aren't heavy to the extent that you are cutting the root of your ordination. So those ones, any of the ones that are naturally negative, we need to do regular purification to purify. Then for all of those that are prescribed by the Buddha, then the way to purify those is through doing the fortnightly posada. So that's why doing the posada ceremony is important, because we go and we, confess the precepts that, may or may not be naturally negative, and we say we did them, and then that's why it says in the ceremony, know that I am pure, that my precept body is pure, that I can attend the posada with purity. Okay? So that's how it's done. Oh no, you can take refuge at one time, the 5 lay precepts at another time, monastic precepts later on. Or some people take refuge and some or all of the lay precepts. Some people say, I'm not ready for all 5, I'll take 4 or 3 or whatever. Now the posada itself is for restoring the precepts in the sense that we went against what the Buddha said, but the negativity part of an action that was naturally negative, that we need to purify with the 4 opponent powers. That's what our anagarikas do. So you can take the 8 precepts for one day. Very often they're just taken for one day, or you can take them for a period of time. And so that's what the anagarikas do. Well, the Mahayana precepts, the 8 Pratimoksha precepts and the 8 Mahayana precepts, they look alike, but they're not alike. Okay? So the 8 Pratimoksha precepts, they're the same precepts. There's some slight difference in the details of how you keep them, but very slight. But the 8 Pratimoksha precepts, anagarika, your minimum motivation, there has to be aspiration for liberation. When you take the 8 Mahayana precepts, you generate bodhicitta, and you take them with that. Which is why monastics are allowed to take the 8 Mahayana precepts, but they're not allowed to take the 8 Pratimoksha one-day precepts because that's considered a lower ordination. So you never take a lower ordination once you have a higher one. But the 8 Mahayana precepts are in a different ball game, so monastics can take those. So actually, maybe I should say there's 8 kinds of Pratimoksha precepts. Yeah. So you start with the the 5 lay precepts for men and for women. Those are 2. Well, actually, you start first with the 8 one-day precepts. Okay. Then you have male and female upasaka, upasika, who have the 5 precepts. Yeah. Then you have the shramanera, shramaneri, who have the 10 precepts. And then you have the bhikshu and bhikshuni who have the full precepts. Oh, and in the middle there, you have after the shramanera, shramaneri, you have the shikshamana for the nuns, which is a 2-year ordination. But here at the Abbey, we're trying to make things as gender equal as we can. So even though technically the monks, men, can take the shramanera ordination with 10 precepts and the bhikshu ordination in the same day, I don't think that's really helpful for people. So just as the women have a 2-year period, then the men also here at the Abbey have a 2-year period of practicing the shramanera precepts before taking bhikshu precepts. Yeah. Because I think if people rush into things too quickly, it often doesn't work well. Yeah, it's very common because they often take the shramanera when they're little kids. Yeah. So that you're not allowed to take the full ordination till you're 20. So, for that whole period when they're under 20, they have the shramanera. And then many people who are, when they take the precepts also as adults, they'll choose to keep the shramanera precept before taking the bhikshu precept. They're 2 separate sets of precepts. The Mahayana precepts are taken for 1 day. If you want to take them for many days, you can do that also. There's no problem. But And so the 8 Mahayana precepts you'll find in the Tibetan tradition, in the Chinese tradition. You won't find in the Theravada countries. Yeah, but in the Theravada countries, they'll take the 8 one-day precepts that are Pratimoksha precepts. No, the eight, whether they're the 8 Pratimoksha or the 8 Mahayana, you take them for one life. For 1 day, they were designed that way so that lay people could have the experience for 1 day of keeping morality, ethical conduct a little bit more attentively. So most people, that's the way you do it. It's just for 1 day. But if somebody wants to take them for longer, then they can do that.